Well, South Africa has spent years trying to rebuild its clothing, textile, footwear and leather manufacturing base, which was decimated by a flood of cheap Chinese imports in the early 90s. And there are some signs that the needle is finally moving, very encouragingly. In an otherwise pretty miserable year for manufacturing, output across the sector fell 1.3% last year. Textiles and clothing managed to grow 0.7%, the only manufacturing division to record growth. But it's also an industry facing a brutal new form of competition in the form of Shein and Temu, which generated roughly 7.3 billion rand in South African sales in 2024, capturing almost 3.6% of the overall clothing, textile, footwear and leather market. So can localization and development finance and smarter manufacturing turn this into a globally competitive, jobs-rich industry again? Well, joining me is Nicole Moonsamy, Head of Textiles and Wood Products at the Industrial Development Corporation, the IDC. It's a really fascinating topic. Nicole, great to have you on the show. Let's just start with the patient before we prescribe the medicine. How healthy is South African clothing, textile, footwear and leather today?
Thanks, Michael. I think if we had to give a diagnosis, we are stable but critical. We are massive opportunities present to the manufacturing space. We've seen the impact of the retail clothing and textile footwear leather master plan showing massive growth in demand profiles. But we have a competitiveness challenge. Our manufacturers are known to be resilient, as all South Africans are, but we do have to place a lot more emphasis on doing things better. I think in your introduction, you spoke to smarter manufacturing technologies. And that's where we need to place our focus, is how do we do what we do really well, but more competitively to be able to compete against the likes of our e-fashion retailers and just generally provide a product to the consumer that is looking for something of a better quality at a lower price point. So it's a bit of a dynamic that we need to balance the requirements of a retailer, the requirements of the end customer, but still maintaining a stable business model that is sustainable, competitive, and able to grow jobs in an environment which employment is growing at an unexpected rate.
Yeah, that unemployment number recently was a real call to arms to everyone to try and bring their piece of the puzzle to solve for unemployment. A big part of that is ensuring we are competitive, to your point. Where are the real competitive pressure points now in the industry? Is it electricity? It feels like that load shedding at least is a thing of the past, but the cost of electricity is now the big issue. Is it logistics? Where are you seeing the big pressure points?
So if we looked internally within South Africa, it's the challenge around electricity. As you mentioned, the cost of electricity. We look at the cost of our labor. We have a very regulated labor sector, which is great for our employee rights. But at the same time, we sort of punch on uneven grounds when we look at our immediate neighbors having labor rates at significantly lower rates to ours. And then if we look at it more in a holistic global perspective, we can't ignore the impact of geopolitics on the cost of logistics, the cost of oil. The general costs of doing business have increased significantly, which has created a very difficult landscape for South African manufacturers to almost have an even playing ground with our competitors coming out of the east and even closer to shore on the African continent.
So, I mean, if we look at what we've done, given all of those competitive pressures, the fact that overall manufacturing contracted, but clothing actually grew 0.7%. That seems to me to be a fairly meaningful inflection point. Or are we making too much of a small positive number here?
Working in the clothing space, Michael, there's no such thing as a small success. We see every positive movement as something to be celebrated. We have seen significant increase in local demand, and that is fantastic. Under the implementation of the RC2FL master plan, we've seen local retailers increase their local procurement up to the above 40 to 45% mark. The challenge we face, however, is that we're not seeing a concurrent increase in the formal retail and manufacturing space. So we see a lot of growth in manufacturing capacity, but these tend to be in the more informal and unregulated sectors. So we are seeing a growth in manufacturing output, but it's not at the levels of compliance that we need for our country to earn a proper living wage. And that's where the challenge resides.
I see. So as the IDC, you obviously play an important role in supporting the industry. Maybe you could just share a little bit more about what the IDC is doing in the space to ensure that we can build on those really significant wins. As you say, I don't think there are any small wins in this industry.
Yeah. So our role as the IDC is to play a counter-cyclical role, effectively. When the economy is moving in a negative direction, we need to take additional risk and try and build up manufacturing confidence and capacity to be ready for when that manufacturing tide turns. So our role as the IDC is not purely to be a funder. Yes, we can do direct equity, we can do debt, we can do concessionary-based funding mechanisms. But the crux of what we do is a convening role. We bring together stakeholders, we bring together policymakers, influential participants in the value chain, and see how do we create the enabling environment to be counter-cyclical in a manufacturing landscape and school that is actually under pressure. And that is the role we want to play right now, is that convening, engaging, enabling role to create a better manufacturing space.
And that, it's such an important distinction, that, because they're very different jobs. Funding one good manufacturer or taking equity in a business, relatively straightforward. Rebuilding, spinning and weaving and dyeing and design and footwear and logistics, ultimately access to retailers requires coordination across the value chain. I think that's where someone or an institution like the IDC has a great network, great base of institutional capacity and knowledge to be able to lean into that. One of the interesting programs is the Clothing and Textile Competitiveness Program. Where does that sit today? What support can a manufacturer actually apply for under this program?
So the Clothing and Textile Footwear Leather Growth Program is a funding scheme that is owned by the DTIC, the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, and administered by the IDC. The scheme is aimed at creating and promoting businesses to become more competitive and to increase the competitive landscape to not only be competitive for South Africa, but to support the export markets. And the scheme focuses on 5 main categories. It's a combination of grant funding and 0% interest loan, and can be applied to capital equipment upgrades, working capital, specific emphasis on development of small businesses and fashion designers. This is a niche element within the South African economy that we don't generally pay much attention to. We see a lot of South African homegrown brands, but we tend to miss the point that most of these are manufactured offshore. And what we want to try and do is bring these South African brands and names back into the platform to develop a creative industry as well as a very artisanal skill industry. If we look at things like shoemaking, that the art of being a cobbler is something that's been long lost, but yet it's something that is so intrinsic to our sector. And a critical element of the program is a clustering and a special projects. We realize that we cannot do this journey on your own, and inclusivity is not going to happen per chance. So we are promoting the development of clusters and centers of excellence where people can pull their resources together, funding can provide a bit of non-funding to the enterprise, and together we can develop value chains that make sense. As you alluded to, Michael, developing spinning, weaving, dyeing is not a once-off objective. You need collaboration and you need coordination. And that is the crux of what the program is all about, is how do we develop this as a value chain.
It's so interesting because I often look at the Chinese success in any manufacturing vertical. What they've been successful at is doing that, building these ecosystems that all support each other and feed each other from a competitiveness perspective. And I was in the Joburg CBD the other day, and David Klale has taken up 5 floors in a building. He's doing exceptionally well. We've got local talent, lots of it. So it's really encouraging to hear that the IDC is thinking like this, and the DTIC as well. When a business or a designer or an aspirant cobbler approaches you, what does the IDC look for when assessing funding applications from businesses in the sector? Maybe, I'm sure it's a long checklist, but maybe you can just give us an insight as to how you'll evaluate a business.
It is a long checklist, but it comes down to three things. We need a viable business plan. We need to find something that is meaningful to the economy and meaningful to the shareholder. We're all here to actually secure our livelihoods. So we don't want to invest in business that's just merely here to tick over. We need something sustainable, something sound, and something that has real economic merit. The second element we look at is the developmental impact. We're not purely here to fund to get a financial return. Everything we fund has to have a developmental meaning at backbone. So what is the impact of your business on the environment? What is the impact of the environment on your local skill sets? Or what are you doing for uplifting your community? How are we developing the youth? How are we empowering Black industrialists, women? That's all of the developmental backbone elements that become quite critical in the business plan. And the third point, which is not necessarily the last point, but actually the most critical of all, is implementation and the ability of management to implement a viable business plan and a developmental backbone. We've always said that we don't fund assets, we fund people. And if we don't have the right partners that are going to implement these great ideas, then it's just money and pieces of machinery that don't actually impact the industry or impact the economy. So if we get a business plan that produces both, that's the perfect recipe.
It certainly sounds like a much more outcomes-based approach, which again is great to see. Glodina, is a critical example of this kind of IDC intervention, and its support to major local manufacturing. What challenges, because I think it's a very well-known brand, but what challenges was the Glodina company facing prior to IDC intervention? And then when you came in, what kind of support did you provide to the company?
That was a passion project of love. So Glodina was a legacy brand that we all grew up on. And unfortunately, with influx of product out of the East, we had lost a fair amount of our competitive landscape. If we look at the early 1990s, Glodina had a market share of close on to 80% of the South African market. When we came on board in 2018, it was down to 30%. So we had lost all of this to imports. And fundamentally, when you lose the demand profile, Havana manufacturing entity of that scale just started burning through cash instead of actually doing the developmental impact that it needed. And one of the challenges we faced was that we needed more demand. But how do we match the demand to where the business was? And there's no amount of money that can fix that. So this took time. It took a lot of engagement with our stakeholders, with the workers' unions, the retailers, the local governments in the area in which we was based. And over a period of 5 years, we rebuilt our market brand. We rebuilt the skill sets that was needed. And we're now building up towards having this market presence that we used to have. And I can comfortably say that we're back up to closer to the 50% mark in terms of market share. But it does require intentional marketing, intentional designing, and intentional attention to competitiveness.
Yeah, and intention is something that I'm hearing all throughout this, and that nothing happens by chance. It's all part of a broader strategic program. Let's get to the smaller player, though, because, if you look at the big retailers, they want reliability, they want volume, they want consistency, and often those requirements naturally favor the established larger manufacturers. So how does a small manufacturer or an emerging Black industrialist ever break into that circle?
It comes back to this initial thought we've been speaking about. You can't do it alone. And the responsibility lies both on the retailer as well as the manufacturer. We've been working with our retailers through the program the IDC has called an SME Connect program, where we look at where retailers are lacking in certain categories and use their enterprise development to build up value chains that can help bring in smaller manufacturers into their supply base. And that has been really critical in us bringing together critical mass for smaller manufacturers that actually meet the minimum requirements that retailers are looking for. But on the flip side, it is also up to manufacturers to actually band together and look at where the skill sets can be found and provide an opportunity for retailers to come and engage with it. So it's not finding the skill sets that you don't have in the fellow participants in the market. Looking at what are you doing from your product development side that someone else is doing. And the critical thing that I'd want to say is funding doesn't solve the problem. Funding is an enabler. And the IBC has moved away from being just a provider of funding, but to be that convener and connector of people that can actually create the environment for smaller businesses to participate.
To me, that's essentially the role of development finance, which is to go beyond just finance and ultimately to create companies and ecosystem environments that no longer need the development finance intervention, but you've got to get that ball rolling and kind of, be that catalyst in the space. And so far, so good. The success is in the numbers, and we wish you everything of the best in carrying out that mission. Thank you very much for your time. Nicole Moonsamy, Head of Textiles and Wood Products at the Industrial Development Corporation. Great having you share all of that fantastic insight with us here on Business Talk.